Hello, hello. I'm Casey.
And I'm Fallon.
And this is
Render the Darkness.
Today we're going to be covering the killing spree of Michael Silka. This is going to be our first case out of Alaska.
You didn't do a fun fact.
I'm about to.
Oh.
It's the very next sentence.
So, never mind.
Someone's excited for this episode's fun fact, apparently. So before we get into the case, the fact for this episode is a bee can travel up to 60 miles in a day gathering food.
Ooh.
It's a long way to travel for a little teeny tiny bee.
Yes, it is. Little tiny bee legs. It's all the pollen.
And now that we have our fun fact.
Bee butts. They're super cute. You ever seen a bee butt?
I've not ever
In a
taken
flower?
the time to focus on a bee butt. No.
Well, and they're like in a little flower. They're so cute, little bubble butts.
Okay.
Same.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your interest in the butts of bees.
Bubble butts.
So now that we have our fun fact, we are going to begin the case, and I will let you know that this is a heartbreaking case. I personally had never heard of it, and it is just tragic pretty much all the way around, so just a heads up on that one. But let's get into it. Michael Allen Silka was born in Cook County, Illinois on August 20th, 1958. I know that his father's name was Frank, and he had at least one brother named Steve, and I did read another source that mentioned another brother also named Frank, so just in case that's true, I went ahead and added that in there. But as far as his childhood and his family, I couldn't really find a whole lot about that. There were some interviews done by neighbors and old classmates that varied in description of who Silka was growing up. Some said he was a normal kid with typical boy wants and needs, such as being outside, fishing, and weapons, especially firearms. Others would say that he was troubled, had always been troubled, and others would classify him as a troublemaker. But most people unanimously classified him as a loner. But as far as his actual at-home life, from what I could find and read, it seemed like he had a pretty good home life. He was loved, he was given attention, he wasn't abused, which is kind of unusual for this type of case, because typically there's a pattern of that type of thing happening in the household when they're kids, but I didn't find anything that suggested that he experienced any of that growing up.
Huh.
As he grew into his teenage years, the run-ins with the law and interest in illegal activity would also grow. The first arrest on his record that I could find was when he would try to steal weapons and camp gear from a sporting goods store located in Des Plaines, Illinois. That arrest took place in 1975 when Silka was 17 years old.
Oh, starting young.
He did. Also in 1975, I read that Silka and his brother Steve would run away with the hopes of living in the Canadian wild, but they ran out of survivor gear and other provisions and had to return home. His next recorded arrest came in February of 1977 when he would be picked up for carrying a firearm openly through a park.
Oh, that's not good.
No. I think I read it was a black powder rifle, which was an antique rifle.
Oh, you mean like from back in the day where they'd pour the gunpowder in and they'd use a little thingy and then pop?
Yeah, something like that. I think that was called a muzzle loader.
A musket?
Or maybe a musket. I don't know. I don't know about guns.
Yeah, I don't know about older ones, or even newer ones.
So you two don't know about guns. Okay. Later that year, I think I read it was about a month later in one resource, but either way, he would be picked up again for carrying that same rifle openly through a field in town. Why he still had that same rifle, I don't know, but he did.
Wow. Okay.
He did actually graduate from high school in Hoffman Estates High School, where he lived at the time. But by the time he graduated, he had already been arrested several times for many different things, such as burglary, resisting arrest, unlawful use of a weapon, and shoplifting.
Dang.
With his troubled teen years, one of the family friends, Foreman Hurst, was able to convince Silka that his best move might be to join the military. So he did. Silka would go on to join the U.S. Army. In 1981, he was transferred to Fort Wayne Wright, which I read it is located just east of Fairbanks, Alaska. But that was what I read in one source, but in another I read it was actually not outside of Fairbanks, but it was actually in Fairbanks on the east.
Okay.
I think it's important to note that when he was in the Army during basic training, he was listed as an expert marksman with the weapons M16 and grenade launcher.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's also important to note again that was while he was in basic training, right, which is the first thing you do when you go into the military, which means he went into the Army already a well-experienced or practiced shooter. It's like he already knew how to shoot well already before any kind of training.
Right, okay.
The Army career he enrolled for didn't last long. He would end up having several run-ins with military police. In the short period he was in the military, he had gotten charged with firing a weapon in the barracks and assault.
Wow, that's not smart.
It was not smart. But he would be discharged from the Army in 1981. When that happened, he would return back to Illinois in the Chicago area and kind of job hop for a little bit until he got pulled over in November of 1982 for a traffic violation where the officer who pulled him over noticed a weapon in the seat. It would turn out he had multiple weapons in his car. I read that he had 4 firearms and 2 knives.
Dang, what the heck was he doing with all that stuff in his car?
He just really liked weapons.
Wow, okay.
He was like really obsessed with guns.
Huh.
He was obviously arrested and charged with possession of weapons, and I also read that he would get slapped with resisting arrest on that one because once they got to the police station, he didn't want to get out of the squad car. They had to drag him out.
Huh, okay.
And less than a year later, in July of 1983, he was arrested again for another weapons charge, as well as speeding, which is what he was originally pulled over for when they, yet again, found a weapon in his car.
Golly.
He would have warrants for his arrest issued shortly after this arrest due to failure to appear after he didn't show up for court. Instead of showing up for court, he decided he would flee to Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, to be more exact, where he would start staying in a little cabin out there. He tried to make his cabin as remote as possible, but there were neighbors, and apparently he had quite a few run-ins with them as well. One of those neighbors was Roger Culp. Before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about Roger.
Okay.
Roger Francis Culp was born on May 28, 1950 in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. His parents' names were John Culp and Rosemary Culp. He had 2 brothers, John Culp and Douglas Culp, and he had 2 daughters as well. Their names were Jennifer Culp and Corinne Culp, or Corinne Culp. I read he originally moved to Alaska to work for the pipelines, but ultimately decided to stay, and at the time of this incident, he was working as a wood cutter or chopper. I wish I had more information about him and who he was as a person. I tried to find more on Roger's life before this tragedy, but information was sadly sparse. Unfortunately, Roger is believed to be Silka's first victim. On April 28, 1984, and I should say that there's a couple different versions of what happened or why Culp went into Silka's cabin in the first place, but regardless of which story you hear, at the end of it, witnesses would claim they heard gunshots shortly after he entered the cabin. I'm not sure why they didn't immediately call authorities, but I'm not them, and I wasn't there, so I'm sure there was a reason. I know most people in the area were pretty frightened by him and his bizarre behavior, so I don't know if that played a role in their delay to call or not. I did read in one source that the witness who heard the gunshots armed herself and hid in her cabin and didn't report the situation for 9 days.
Oh, wow. Like, so they seen him go into the cabin and then they heard the gunshots?
Correct. And I don't know how accurate this is, but I will say that in one version, like I said, there's many different versions, but in one version of the events, the reason that Roger went to Silka's cabin in the first place is because Roger and another female neighbor were outside chopping wood, and then I guess Silka had gone up to them and like split some of the wood in a way that caused the wood chippings to like flail and fly and hit the woman, and that upset Roger. So Roger was actually going to the cabin to confront Silka about his behavior and how he had hit the woman with the wood.
Okay.
That's one version of why he went. Another version was that he wasn't angry at all. He was just going to visit or attempt to visit or create some kind of a neighborly relationship there. So there's a couple different versions of why Roger went to the cabin at all. But if the version with the woman is true, the witness that they're referring to here, who grabbed the gun and hid and didn't call for 9 days, that may have been that woman.
Maybe, yeah.
If that's true, that may be who that was.
Yeah.
So there was also a story about a different neighbor who believed Silka had stolen some moose hide from her. And literally the day after Culp went missing, she decided to go confront Silka. When she approached the cabin, after no one answering the door, she decided to look around, and that's when she saw some blood on the ground. And behind the cabin, she reported seeing a snow mound that had been freshly made.
Oh, no.
Silka never did answer the door for her that day. She would call a friend of hers to tell him about the bizarre situation, and he too would go to Silka's. Silka would answer the door this time, and promised the man to bring the woman's hides back. Freaked out by Silka's behavior, he would tell another friend about the situation and what the woman claimed to have seen, and just the interaction and how bizarre it was. The three of them would together call the Alaska State Troopers, who would go to Silka's house, her cabin. Somehow, the troopers, when they went there originally thinking that both men were missing. Because one of the things that they reported also was that Roger hadn't been seen since being seen going into the cabin.
Right.
And they had reported hearing the gunshots as well. But when they went there, like I said, they originally thought that both of the men were missing. They actually even thought, if anything, that Roger might have done something to Silka.
Okay.
But that quickly changed once they got to Silka's cabin. When looking around the yard, they found a moose hide and some blood. They knocked on the cabin door, and Silka identified himself, and when asked about the blood, he claimed it was from a moose. They accepted that answer, and they left.
They didn't look around or nothing.
Nope, not that time. They saw the blood, and they left. Because the reason I think that is the way that played out is because, like I said, when they went there originally thinking that Roger had done something to Silka. So once they seen that Silka was fine, I think they kind of thought, okay, the situation has molded itself down.
Okay, gotcha.
You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. When the original witness did finally report Culp missing 9 days after hearing the gunshots, the Alaska State Troopers headed straight back to Silka's cabin, and this time they had a search warrant in their hand to search everything.
Good.
Not surprisingly, Silka was gone by this point. This is when the troopers did decide to go ahead and test the bloodstains that they had found on the ground, and the blood would come back as belonging to a human. Meanwhile, Silka wasn't just hiding or sitting idle. He was going on pretty much just rage and an urge for violence at this point. He had already loaded his truck, a 1974 Dodge Monaco, with all the firearms, ammunition, and hunting gear he could fit, and he had loaded his canoe and attached it to the top of his truck as well. By the time he stopped the truck, Silka would have made it about 160 miles away from his cabin in Fairbanks at a town called Manly Hot Springs. This town sat on the Tanana River. This river is a runoff river, meaning it's fed by glaciers and ice runoff, and because of that, it's very heavily silted. It also reaches a width of about 1 mile in certain points and can reach a depth of up to 80 feet. Plus, because it's fed by the ice and the glaciers, the temperature of the river are said to stay around freezing pretty much at all times.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I was like, ooh, that's going to be some cold-ass water.
Yeah. By the time Silka unfortunately landed here in 1984, the population of Manly Hot Springs was a mere 50 to 70 residents. So
wow.
A very small town.
Yeah.
There's a whole story behind why their population had dwindled down to so low, but that's another case for another day.
Gotcha.
It was May 13th, 1984, on Mother's Day, when Silka arrived to the town, and he immediately came across as bizarre and scary to some of the residents. But to others, he managed to convince them that he was an outdoor man, and some were even impressed with his skills in the outdoors and his marksmanship. I also read that there was a couple of people who had reported that he was carrying around a large hunting knife that he was like obsessively sharpening the whole time that they seen him. Like when he would come into the actual town,
that's creepy.
That's what he would be doing.
So you just walk around the street with a sharpening stone,
just walking around sharpening a hunting knife, and there was a couple of different reports about that. So. Robert E. Lee had reported that Silka had told the community and convinced the community that he planned to settle down there. Silka had set up a tent close to the river and a boat landing near the river. One unique thing about Manly Hot Springs that I think is important to this case is that that's actually where the road ends on Alaska Route 2. So the road dead ends there.
Okay.
So you kind of can't get out of the town without going back the way you came in.
Right, okay.
Within a few days of Silka arriving to Manly Hot Springs, Alaska, 7 people would go missing. All on May 17th, 1984, and all after having gone to the Manly Hot Springs boat launch, where Silka was known to have been camping out.
7 people in the same day?
7 people on the same day.
Whoa.
Let's talk about who these people were. And only 4 of these 7 people would ever be found.
Dang, that sucks.
It's horrible. I told you, this case is just heartbreaking. Okay, so we're going to talk now about the missing people, or about the victims. Fred Burke, born August 31st, 1953, known as a fisherman and a fur trapper and a homesteader. He was also known as a very kind and generous man, and he was known for his ability to be able to navigate the Alaskan wilderness. His boat would be found near the landing close to where Silka was. Burke's wife would flag down the troopers during their search for Silka to inform them her husband was among the missing people, and he had boated into the Manly Hot Springs launch on May 17th. And sadly, on June 23rd, Burke's wife, I think I read her name was Liller, she would be the one who actually found her husband's body in the river about 75 miles away from the boat launch, where he was believed to have been murdered by Silka.
Oh, wow.
He was only 30 years old.
Oh, gosh.
Next victim, Albert Hagen Jr. Albert Moulton Hagen Jr. was born on April 9th, 1957 in St. Johnsbury, Vermont in Caledonia County. His parents' names were Albert and Rose Marie Hagen. He had a brother, Richard Dean Ricky Hagen. And he was technically considered an Alaskan native who had just gone back to Alaska around 6 weeks before the date of his murder. He'd been staying with his parents since he'd been back in Alaska, but before he came back to Alaska, he had been living in California for 10 years prior, before coming back, and he was a construction worker by trade. Unfortunately, his body was among the bodies that were never recovered, but he is believed to be one of Silka's victims due to his last known location being the Manly Hot Springs boat launch on May 17th, and him having gone missing after that. He was only 27 years old. The next victim was Lyman Klein. Lyman Marshall Klein was born December 18th, 1947. He was married to Joyce Hennifer Klein, who was born in 1954. The couple shared a son by the name of Marshall Lawrence Klein, born 1981. Lyman was well known in the community for his generosity and his carpentry skills, which is what he did for a living as well. The family sadly had chosen to go out for a family outing and to just have a peaceful family day. They made their way to the boat landing at the worst possible time, and in a horrible turn of events, the family would become victims of Silka. Lyman was 36. Joyce, who was also 4 months pregnant at the time of the murders, she was only 30, and poor little Marshall was only 2.
Oh my God.
Lyman's body would be recovered, but unfortunately, Joyce and Marshall's would not.
Oh.
They also would go on to find blood at what was believed to be the crime scene, and it was thought that the blood belonged to the young family. Next victim, Del Medeski. Del Kevin Medeski was born April 28, 1964 in Mount Clemens, Michigan. He was a cabin builder as well as a carpenter. He was said to be easygoing, loved the outdoors, and had a great reputation in town. His body was recovered, and he was only 20 years old.
Dang. Poor people.
Next victim. I know, I'm not communicating much outside of the case because I'm trying to hold back tears.
Right, yeah.
Because it's just sad. Next victim was Larry Joe McVeigh. He was born January 30th, 1946. He was married to Alice McVeigh and was a U.S. Army veteran and a fur trapper. It was also noted that he had physical disabilities due to his time in the Vietnam War, where he had encountered a booby-trapped gasoline can, and it resulted in his physical injuries.
Oh, wow.
His body would be recovered from the river several weeks after the incident. He was only 38 years old.
All these people are so young.
It's believed that Silka shot all of these victims and then threw them in the river, where they were quickly swept away. It's believed that Robert Culp was also thrown into the river, but his body was never found or recovered. He was 34 years old. And for Robert, this is just speculation as far as him being put in the river, as his body was never found. Troopers were alerted the following day after Alice, Joe's wife, grew concerned when her husband still hadn't come home. She drove to the boat launch to look for him. Once she got there, she immediately noticed her husband's boat was still at the launch, and his beer was in his truck, but Joe was nowhere to be seen. She would call the Alaska State Troopers, who would initially tell her to just wait a little bit. They were sure he would show back up. That changed very quickly when more relatives of the missing persons began to express concern. Another family member would go to the launch, but this person would call the trooper station and report Silka's truck and his license plate, originally thinking it might belong to someone else that might be missing. Once the troopers ran the plate, it came back as belonging to Silka, who was wanted for the murder of Roger Culp. Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Roger. It is Robert. I apologize. Robert Culp. By this point, the troopers had received calls of at least 7 people who were missing, and this caused them to launch an aerial search. As concerned as they were about the missing people, their first concern was that one of them was wanted for murder.
Right.
On May 19th, 1984, they would find blood on the ground and drag marks on the ground around the launch. which told them that the bodies were probably drugged to the river, and this escalated the seriousness of the situation, and they would implement all possible measures to begin locating any of the missing people, as well as Silka. To this day, it is still one of the most extensive manhunts that has ever happened in Alaska.
Dang.
It would turn out that Silka had attempted to flee in his canoe from the crime scene, but was stopped by ice in the river, so he didn't make it very far.
Good.
He made it about 25 miles away in a tributary of the Zitzzianya River, still part of the Tanana River. He was there with his canoe and Fred Burke's boat. Silka was spotted by the helicopters that were searching for him. They offered Silka the opportunity for a peaceful surrender, and in response, Silka would step out from behind a tree and fire at one of the helicopters. Sadly, he used a rifle, and he would strike and kill Trooper Troy L. Duncan, who was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and had only been a trooper since 1981. It killed him instantly.
Gosh.
Captain Donald Lawrence was hit by the bullet fragments from that shot in the face, and Trooper Jeff Hall returned fire on Silka, killing him instantly.
Good.
They would go on to hold a memorial service at the boat launch for the victims on May 20th, despite recovery efforts still being made for weeks after this. Of the 4 bodies recovered were Larry Joe McVeigh, Dale Medeski, Lyman Klein, and the last to be recovered was Fred Burke. There's still no known motive for Silka choosing to go on this killing spree. He hadn't been in Alaska long at all and had no known attachments to this town or any of the victims. I think he was just a violent and angry man that just snapped one day.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
He had a history of violence that seemed to just escalate more and more over the years. And to make matters worse for this town, as if it hadn't suffered enough, because of the time that he had served in the Army, and because he was somehow honorably discharged from the Army, despite Silka being cremated, Silka's father had requested for him to be buried in the Sitka National Cemetery, which is located literally right next to the Alaska State Troopers training camp.
Oh my God.
Which means not only was he given a grave in a military cemetery, which is meant to be a place for honorable veterans who served our country, and Silka did not deserve that burial location in the eyes of the locals, and rightfully so.
Right, yeah.
I would feel the exact same way. So not only that, but he also was right next to the very academy that had trained one of his victims. Which is so disrespectful and infuriating in my opinion. But yeah, this whole thing was just tragic all the way around, and rest in peace to all of the victims.
I'm surprised his grave, I don't condone it in any way, but I'm surprised that his grave has not been messed with. I know it's on the military property or whatever, but I'm still surprised somebody has not done something to that grave.
I read in one source that it was unmarked, but I'm pretty sure when I was doing this investigation, I was able to come across a headstone for him. I know that it said Silka. I'm not sure if it says his first name or not. And in fact, I'm going to look that up right now to see.
Another thing, I don't see how the military honorably discharged him.
I have no idea either. I thought the same thing. He was charged with the firing the gun in the barracks and assault. I also didn't really understand how he got an honorable discharge, but for whatever reason he did.
Where he said it earlier.
As you can see here, he
Michael
actually does have a
Silka.
tombstone, and it does have his name on it.
Wow. See that? I don't think he should be there.
I also don't think he should be there. I think that that's about one of the biggest slaps in the face to the victims of his horrible crime that they could get outside of the horrible crime.
Yeah.
I understand that the Army is required to uphold the request of their veterans' wishes. I understand that, but I do think that there should be some exceptions to that.
Well, I mean, you figure, like, if, like you said, I understand, they're supposed to uphold their wishes or respect their wishes and stuff. But if they are a murderer, I think they should be able to be like, no.
Yeah, he would end up murdering a total of 9 people.
Yeah, so he shouldn't, there's no way he should be buried where he was buried. I don't care what his father's, I don't know.
I can tell you that the residents of Manly Hot Springs were absolutely infuriated. Now, granted, he was cremated, so his ashes were what was spread there, so his body isn't there. But he does have his own plot, and he does have his own tombstone. And his ashes were spread on the ground there. So, he was cremated.
Well, I mean, I guess it kind of makes it a little bit better that his body isn't there, like, putting toxic crap in the ground. But, still.
Yeah, it's, pretty sad. The whole thing was just pretty sad.
Yeah.
But that is our first case for Alaska. Sorry I picked such a heavy one. But next episode after this one will be Fallon doing a case out of Alaska as well. And it will be followed by paranormal.
Yeah, we're going to do the
case.
Do some ghosties. And I think we were talking about it earlier. And I think what we might end up doing, instead of making it like focusing on just ghosts of each state, we might, just mix it up to where, it could be like, what did you say, mystery?
Yeah, like a mystery episode where it may be folklore or cryptids, or it may be a compilation of paranormal plus those things. If you watched the My Alabama Paranormal Case, I kind of did that. I had 2 paranormal stories, and then I had like a strange and bizarre story in there as well. So they may not all be paranormal every time, because a lot of states in this country just have a lot of different history and stories and things to be shared. So we may switch that up sometimes.
Yeah.
But other than that, thank you guys for spending your time with us and listening. And yeah, that's about it. We are
Render the Darkness. Bye.